All right, it's a bit better. All right, it's nice to see so many people here. Welcome to Politics and Prose. My name's Rich. I'm a bookseller here, where we now host in-person events as well as virtual events, along with trips, classes, subscriptions, which you can all find on our website. So before we get started today, I'm just going to run over just a bit of housekeeping. If you can just keep your phones on silent or turn them off during the event so as not to disrupt it, that'd be great. When we get to the time to open the floor to questions, we've placed a standing microphone which is just in front of this pillar here. So if you can line up just to the right of the pillar there to ask your questions, and just make sure you're speaking to the microphone so we can all hear you. And we are both audio streaming and live streaming tonight's event, so we want to hear the questions on the stream as well. So once the event is complete, we'll ask you to fold the chairs up and just prop them up against the side just to help us out a bit. And then after the Q&A, we'll have the sign up here at this table. So if you've not bought the book, you can buy the book behind the register. And then we'll again ask you to line up next to the right of this pillar here. And we'll come down and probably ask your names just to make the signing go a bit quicker as well. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome Kyla Sommers, who will be talking about her new book, When the Smoke Cleared, the 1968 Rebellions and the Unfinished Battle for Civil Rights in the nation's capital. When the Smoke Cleared tells the story of Washingtonians who seized the moment to rebuild a more just society, one that would protect and foster black political and economic power. A vital chapter in the struggle for racial equality, When the Smoke Cleared is an account of open wounds, paths not taken, and their unforeseen consequences, revealed here in all their contemporary significance. Kyla Sommers is the digital engagement editor at American Oversight and was previously the editor-in-chief of the National News Network. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Washington History Journal, and in the book Demand the Impossible, Essays in History as Activism. So Kyla will be joining conversation with Kojo Nnamdi and Tom Sherwood. Kojo is the host of the Politics Hour with Kojo Nnamdi, a live talk show produced by WAMU. In addition to his hosting duties, Nnamdi continues to moderate Kojo in our community events with WAMU, and has chaired the board of the Public Access Corporation of Washington, D.C. since 1997, as well as Tom Sherwood, the resident analyst for the Politics Hour with Kojo Nnamdi, and the contributing writer for the Washington City paper. So before we welcome these, I'd like to welcome Jimmy Williams, who's the executive director of the Washington Literary Center, to share a few words.
Thank you very much, and I promise I will be brief, given that I'm standing between you and the entertainment of the author and the people you really want to see. But first of all, I'm Jimmy Williams. I'm the president and CEO of the Washington Literacy Center. And looking at this book that starts from 1968, the Washington Literacy Center started in 1963. So everything that she's talking about, Dr. Sommers, When the Smoke Clears, we were there. And what we do at the Washington Literacy Center is we focus on adults who are marginalized and who are the people who were on the other side of when all this happened, on 8th Street and Columbia Road. They lived there, they were working there, but they were also struggling with literacy. They were struggling with math, they were struggling with finances, and a lot of the anger, a lot of the people that we serve, they're now the parents and grandparents, and now we're doing this for 3 generations, and it's really a chain that we would like to break. 1963, we were serving people, and now we're in the nation's capital, and there are approximately 129,000 adults who are still struggling with literacy, 179,000 adults that are struggling with math, and those same adults are the people who are living on the margins and who are the people that you will hear about in Dr. Sommers' books. I told her I was going to refer to her as Dr. Sommers because I believe when you do that work, somebody should acknowledge that you've done the hard work. So I'll say 2 things with the Washington Literacy Center. It's our 60th anniversary, so I ask you all to support us as we support all the work and happy with the work that we've done with Politics and Prose. If you're in a giving mood, I'll be standing around holding this, that you can do that. If you want to volunteer or sign up for our newsletter, I have a bag that says Washington Literacy Center, so I'll be doing that. But most importantly, I encourage you all, read the book, buy it again, give some more copies away. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And now,
hello. Good.
Now that Tom's mic is working and mine isn't.
I'll start talking and you just join in. By the way, journalists don't call PhDs doctors. We only call doctors if they can make you take your clothes off.
I'm not going to try that tonight.
So thank you all for coming here this evening, and hopefully you will be rewarded, and we will let you know when it's time to ask questions, and you can start lining up in front of the microphone. So, Kyla Sommers. We know that this book began as a term paper at George Washington University, but when did you begin your stay in Washington, D.C., the stay that caused you to be interested enough in Washington, D.C. to write this book? Tell us about how you came to be in our fair city.
Like many people, I came as an undergraduate. So I've been in DC since I was 18, fell in love with it while I was in undergrad, and then decided to never leave. And so part of that was when you don't know what you want to do next in life, you can always go to more school. And so I went directly from undergrad into a PhD program. And it was then that I felt really committed to the city and decided to keep studying it.
Well, I'm sure many people in this room, like I and Tom, have read many accounts of the riots that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C., but what makes this account different?
I think there's two big things. The first is that I want to shift the focus from destruction and despair. I don't whitewash what happened. It had a huge impact on the city, and there were a lot of things like white flight, difficult finances. There was a lot of destruction. But there's more to the story. There's a whole city that came together and created a blueprint for how to rebuild in a way that would restore economic power to the community, build up social equality, and there was really this powerful idea of what DC could become from this moment. But the Nixon administration kills it. Despite the best planning, DC doesn't have even home rule at that point. They're completely a colony, and it means that despite this really inspiring work, there just wasn't the ability to get it done. And so because it doesn't get done, and because Nixon does come to power and does turn DC into an anti-crime test lab, that's what we've been stuck with, is despair, abandonment, mass incarceration, and that legacy is important, but I want to talk about what DC tried to do, because the intentions of a majority black city in this moment have a lot of lessons for us today. The other thing I'll say just really quick that makes it different is I use a ton of oral history. Most histories that have been written about this before are way too reliant on police records, way too reliant on FBI records. It's like COINTELPRO surveillance. So you only get one side of it and you get not a complete picture. I used, I think, about 50 oral history interviews, so you hear what people who were living in DC on the street, what they took away from it and what they felt about what was happening in the city.
Well, I'm going to ask the next question, because if you listen to the Politics Hour, you'll know that that's probably the last question I'll be able to ask, because after that, Sherwood is going to take over. The news that Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, was broken in Washington during a Democratic Party fundraiser at the Washington Hilton. Now, given what we know about the divisions between the two major political parties today, I think would be interesting to talk a little bit about what the reaction was at that Democratic Party fundraiser, at which Vice President Hubert Humphrey was in attendance. How did they react?
This is a very specific part of the book that I'm really going to have to try and remember. A favorite line from this is that the filet mignon went cold. There was supposed to be this big, I think Johnson was even supposed to give a speech, and he ended up not coming. But at the time, the Democratic Party was still a strange coalition between Southern Democrats that were largely very racist, segregationist, and then Northern Democrats that were pushing more civil rights legislation. And so, for example, William Byrd at the time was still a Democrat from West Virginia. He later transitioned to be Republican. So there's a lot of mixed reactions in the crowd, and I think a direct quote from this great article that I talk about is someone says, of course, I'm from the South, so I'm happy. Versus on the other side, you have Democratic leaders scrambling to try and come up with a response. They've been trying, the Kerner Commission has come out saying that poverty and racial discrimination is the root cause of things like what's happening in DC and rebellions. So it's really a split reaction, and the filet mignon went cold.
And there were people there who didn't think that the event needed to be put off at all.
Yes.
There were some people in the Titanic who kept eating Austin. I have a specific question about the book to get people involved, but I have a feeling your life started before you showed up at George Washington University. Can you, in a nutshell, I always tell this to the interns who work with me, tell me your life story in 30 seconds. Tell us your life story in 30 seconds before GW.
My parents were the children of farmers and school teachers, born in Kentucky, moved around all over the Midwest. They hated their job, so they kept moving, think it would fix it. It never did. I went to high school in Kansas City, Missouri, came to DC, everyone moved to Colorado, and they're still in Colorado.
All right, good, thank you very much. That was under 30 seconds. The image of the police department in the district back in the 1960s. I was here in 1968 at the Navy Yard, and I went to see the riots. It was very interesting. But the image of the city was that it was not really a place of protest before the riots. I want to read this about police brutality. A campaign against police brutality in Washington, D.C. was led by the local National Negro Congress, which built a broad-based coalition. They want a sharp decline in the number of police shootings, a police review board, and new political power in an early civil rights struggle in the city. The date of this, 1936. The image of the district as a sleepy southern town, not really involved. What was happening in Washington in terms of civil rights locally before the riots?
Well, it could go a long ways back.
Or just go a decade back since the World War.
Post-World War II, DC does a ton of activism for basic equality, like equality under the law. And a lot of the tactics that people use is based around the uniqueness of DC. The idea that when diplomats come to the United States, they come to DC, and everyone is going to judge based on this window into into American democracy. And so there's a ton of interest in resolving these contradictions in democracy because we're just defeated fascism and now we're fighting communism. So you see a lot of activism being shaped by that messaging. And then you do get Brown versus Board of Education. In DC, the version is Bowling versus Sharp. There is equality under the law, but it doesn't resolve most of the issues of poverty, racial discrimination, job discrimination, and opportunity.
Was it an integrated? Was this by black communities of Washington? Was it the white community involved, or was it?
In that era, it's both. There's a lot of like State Department interest in resolving these. There's a couple times that African diplomats come to DC, they can't get seated at a restaurant. The State Department has a huge interest in resolving that because it makes them look really bad, especially as so many African countries are decolonizing and gaining power in the world system. And so after desegregation, so many of the same problems persist, and you see a shift to demanding control and power, not just equal access. And so I think that's when you see a lot of different new groups starting up. People like Julius Hobson, who had been a leader in school desegregation, joins more and more radical groups that are demanding their demands are based more and more on power.
Let me ask you about the police in the District of Columbia in the 1960s. What was it like? Was it majority white? Did they even allow African Americans to be on the force? I ask that in part. The big news today is that Chief Robert Conte has resigned as police chief of the district and is going to be going to work for the FBI. The formal announcement will be made tomorrow. And he was
Sherwood always gets the story first.
Well, it was a story about 2 o'clock this afternoon, Coach Joe. You should have been listening to the radio or watching social media. But so something about the police. I remember the police here, but I was a white Southern guy. I fit right in. So what was it like?
I think the statistic is that it was a police force that was 80% white in a city that was 70% black. And it's not just that most of the police officers didn't live in the district, it's that the police department recruited from southern states. And so it's almost, bringing in an ideology that would make it more and more racist. A lot of what I talk about is how tense relations were between police officers and the police department and a lot in the black community in DC prior to the rebellions. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's several times that things nearly do erupt into uprisings before 68 because, for example, 4 boys were arrested for playing football in an alley. Or there was one time that there was supposed to be a fight and the other side didn't show up. And so, it's young kids, so they start throwing rocks at cars instead because they wanted to fight, but they didn't show up. And so the police come and they're like, well, we don't want to make this worse. So they call in community leaders and the community leaders diffuse the situation. But the idea of support your police and tough on crime is so strong that senators freak out that the police didn't arrest everyone and tried to resolve it peacefully, that they give speeches on the Senate floor and, go after the police captain that decided to call in community leaders. So even when they would try and have more peaceful tactics, there were other people that would freak out about it. So there was a lot of tension. It's really, really racialized, and I think it's almost surprising that things didn't erupt prior to 68.
Well, the riots brought all of this to a head. So I'd like you to talk about 2 essentially parallel movements that were taking place at the same time. One of them had to do with how the police handled the riot, how the then mayor of Washington, Walter Washington, and the police handled the riot. The other had to do with the parallel development of a new base of black politics in the city, which was, I guess, characterized by the emergence of something called the Black United Front. Talk about how those 2 things emerged at the same time.
Okay.
Nobody said this was going to be easy.
So in the summer of 1967, it's called the Long Hot Summer, rebellions erupt in both Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. In Detroit, Michigan, it's a complete disaster. The National Guard is called in by actually Senator Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, who was the governor at the time, and 44 people die. The National Guard fired 155,000 rounds of ammunition. It's a complete disaster. And after that, the Johnson administration does a huge review of its policy and how it's going to respond to rebellions and uprisings. And DC is kind of at the forefront of saying we're going to adopt a policy of resistance. So, for example, when the rebellions do happen in DC, the National Guard fired 14, not 14,000, 14 rounds of ammunition, as opposed to 155,000 in Detroit just a year before. So there is a really big reconsideration of how do at this point, the National Guard, how do they interact with the public when there's protests? This also relates to Mayor Washington because Johnson actually appoints Mayor Washington. He's not elected. DC still doesn't have home rule. Basically, for decades, Congress had been trying to create a new system. They can't get it done, and so Johnson creates a city council that's also appointed and a mayor that's appointed. So Washington is a result, Mayor Washington is a result of the Johnson administration. He's faced with trying to create reform in a city that he still has very little power in. But through all of this, DC is 70% black, and this is a reason that Stokely Carmichael, who is one of the founders of Black Power, he was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also called SNCC, he comes and he decides to live in DC because it is 70% black, and he thinks there's an opportunity to have rule by black power in a way that doesn't exist in other places in the country. And so both of these things are kind of happening at the same time. And then in the aftermath, something that I talk about is there's initially a belief that they can work together, and the Black United Front puts together a proposal for how to rebuild. They actually want to be like the contractor that the city hires. And this is something that's a little bit different than we often talk about history, because Mayor Washington is definitely steeped in a traditional civil rights tradition, and Carmichael is very much from the Black Power tradition, but you see cooperation in a way that we don't always talk about.
Before we go back to Tom again, talk a little bit about how the police in DC responded to the riot and how that response gave rise to the emergence of Richard Nixon and the kind of attitude toward policing that becomes prevalent in the United States.
This is a big one. Okay, so the police largely respond with restraint. I'm not going to give them a great grade because there's a lot of racist incidents still. For example, they pulled over a man who was driving his girlfriend to the hospital to give birth to a baby and arrested him. Like, not great. They arrest a firefighter, a black firefighter, who's literally just resting on the street as he's trying to go home. So they're not perfect. There's definitely a lot of incidents of them using racial profiling about who they tell to send home, but there's far, far fewer examples of both arrests and especially violent incidents than there would have been if they hadn't adopted a different style of policing in the preparations for potential uprisings. After the rebellions, there is a huge conservative backlash to how DC approached its policing during this. People, like senators, call the mayor, they call the president and say, you should be shooting anyone who is looting. You should be you should, even if they're running away, shoot to kill. If they're trying to take something, shoot to maim. And this becomes part of the national conversation about arrests and how the police don't have enough power and civil rights has gone too far. Nixon, and crime is high at the time, it becomes a part of that too. So when Nixon is running for president, he makes DC and crime in DC a cornerstone of his agenda about law and order. He talks about DC as the capital of crime.
Crime capital of the world.
The crime capital of the world. He hammers
He personally proved it.
over and over and over again. And then when he's elected, he can't pass national policy very easily but he can impose policy on DC. So DC becomes a laboratory for his policies. Within the first 10 days that he's in office, he publishes a plan on how to fight crime in DC. Most of those provisions, including no-knock warrants, more wiretaps, and mandatory minimums, are adopted into the 1970 DC crime bill. It is disastrous for civil rights in DC, and other states and cities around the country model it. And something that I talk about is how it's one of the bases of mass incarceration today.
And of course, we have the same issue going on now with the Republican House treating the district, as one of the members said about Mayor Bowser, will treat her like a cabinet official, not the elected leader of 700,000 people. Several members on the Hill right now have said that if they could, they'll take back the limited home rule we have. And so there is a very aggressive criticism of the District of Columbia today, even though people are generally more polite about the way they described it. Mm-hmm. But do you think, I had a question of, when Nixon did the war on crime, the DC crime bill said a 3-year maximum prison sentence for robbery of a vending machine, parking meter, or coin telephone. That's how detailed the Congress was in trying to dictate what happens here in the city. As a resident of the city now, just what is your general thought now when you see what Congress is doing, what Mayor Bowser is doing? Do you think, what have we learned from the '68 civil rights riot here that guides us to today? That maybe there's something positive you can say. We never do, we're in the media. But
so one of the ironies of the moment is that a lot of the reforms that DC's council had passed were meant to alleviate some of the harms that came from the 1970 crime bill. It was, trying to reverse some of the mandatory minimums, update the criminal code, and, now they're going after reforms that were passed in the wake of George Floyd's murder. So there's this irony that it's repeating itself, but, something that isn't really talked about as people are pushing tough on crime measures again is that Nixon's plan didn't work. Crime kept rising in DC, and the turn towards harsher policing didn't have an impact. Even though he sent the police chief on a national tour claiming how well it worked, none of that was borne out in the statistics. So I think, as some members of Congress, including Democrats, claim that DC crime is such a big issue that it is worth overturning the will of DC residents and going against democracy to try and fix, they should remember that they've tried that before 50 years ago. It didn't work, but it only exacerbated the harms that cause crime in the first place, which is poverty and inequality.
what was the impact of the Kerner Commission, which was created by Lyndon Johnson, who famously said in its 400-plus page report, "Our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal." We now, in current politics today, we have criticism from the right about people being woke or trying to teach critical race theory. But the Kerner Commission said even back then that systematic racism is undermining the ability of the country to prosper in an equal society. And that's still a debate today. We didn't make much progress.
No.
We've made a lot, but we haven't made as much as some say.
I mean, that's something that's so striking about writing about this and studying this when, I started the project when Michael Brown had been murdered in Ferguson, Missouri by a police officer. And as I was writing what began as a term paper, it was so striking how the rhetoric that was used to discredit protesters, but also the demands that they were making, was almost identical in the 60s and then in 2014. And then again in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, also by a police officer, when mass protests happened across the country, it was once again the same sense that there's no new tactics. It's just call protesters criminals and say that they're using the wrong tactics, and that's enough to say that none of their demands should be met. So if you go back to when the Kerner Commission releases its report, it is in response to mass protests and rebellions and uprisings and what they called riots. And their conclusion, even though they had seen the damage done by these events to cities, was that you have to look at the reasons behind it, and that's inequality. It's not enough to just say these are criminals and this was, an unfortunate event that used the wrong tactics. They actually looked at the reasons why, and we should keep doing that.
Let me ask a question that's not as deep. When the smoke cleared, people want to know, how did you come up with the title? It's a very good title for what you've written about, but how much agony did you go through deciding what you're going to call your book, and what did you reject?
So I wanted the focus to be on the aftermath and not the destruction. The other books that have been written on the subject center the destruction. Most of 14th Street is gone. America on Fire. And I think that acknowledging the anger involved is very important, and we shouldn't downplay it. But like I said, I wanted to bring a different focus on a different legacy of these events, and kind of the other thing. So it was supposed to be, here is a moment when things became clear, when people assessed the damage and said, we can use this moment. The other thing I'll say is my dissertation was called I Believe in the City. And that I also really liked that title. My publisher didn't, but I liked that title too. And that came from a speech that Mayor Washington gave to Congress. He came before Congress in '68. They were having hearings on DC crime. There were several bills that they were posing that would have further lessened the control that DC had over its own affairs. They're literally calling for Marines to patrol DC because they think the city is so far out of control. And Mayor Washington gave this great speech. He said that no one gets to go into your district and run down your town or the people that you represent. You all are coming into my home and running down my people and saying that we can't do this job. But I believe in the city, and I believe in its people, and they can solve this if you just give them a chance. And I think that still is really resonant.
Well, Tom Sherwood and Harry Jaffe wrote a book called Dream City.
Still available.
That described a period of black empowerment in Washington. But that period only came about because, according to your book, what a lot of people saw as disaster, some people saw as opportunity. And among those people were the people who were in the Black United Front, including a number of names that we now know very well: Walter Fauntroy, Stokely Carmichael, Marion Barry, Julius Hobson. And a quick aside, you mentioned one, Chuck Stone. Mm-hmm. Chuck Stone is known to most people as a great columnist and reporter who was nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And so when I read the book, I was like, how could Chuck Stone have been a part of the Black United Front in Washington? Turns out he was working for the Washington Afro-American newspaper at the time, and he was a part of that. But I guess the bigger picture I'd like you to paint is how that was used by those people to try to build a different Washington, including the reinvention of Shaw.
Okay. I keep getting really big questions. So as I mentioned earlier, Stokely Carmichael comes to DC in '67. He thinks DC is a unique opportunity to implement a political vision because it is so predominantly black, and there isn't a government here like anywhere else. There has been so much activism in DC for so long, but it's different camps and they have different ideas. And Carmichael thought, if I can bring everyone together over one roof, and we can talk about our ideas and work together, then we are a Black United Front and we'll be much more effective. Some people hate it. there's several, especially more moderate leaders, that say, who do you think you are coming into DC? We've been doing this work for forever. We don't need you. You're just a Johnny-come-lately. But there's a lot of people that know that he is a huge name, way more famous than any of them. And the fact that he's interested in DC and has that star power is worthwhile and good to engage with. So he does create a coalition of people with vastly different views. And they've been doing a lot of work prior to the rebellions, but after the rebellions, they really see this moment as an ability to coordinate. And so the city council held hearings. They had 4 hearings. There was over 1,500 people attended and over 100 witnesses. And the whole point was to figure out, why did this happen and where do we go from here? And the Black United Front invited all of the people testifying to come and coordinate their message. And basically the message that they said over and over again was, this happened because of inequality. We want control and power. We have to have a say in how the government functions. And anything that comes out of this must empower the community and must resolve these structural inequalities. And by this coordination, they're able to make this message so clear that the city council adopts most of their vision. There's a few radical things, like they didn't want any white owner to be able to rebuild in the area unless they got special permission. Obviously the city council didn't adopt that, but they are able to influence policy in a very real way. And then as the city moves to the next step, which is specific plans, they put together a plan and they want the city to adopt it.
Let me pick up on that. Renewal, rebirth, revitalization largely has meant removal of Black people via gentrification. Are the economic forces that you've written about before and after the uprising, you call it, not a riot? A lot of people in the business community say the economic forces are still just as strong as they were before 1968. There's only been superficial change if you look at the big picture. Do you agree with that the uprising has fallen far short of what it had hoped in 1968?
Yes, but largely because of federal intervention. So one thing that I write about in the book is to continue on with the next question, the last question, which is that they put together a plan for rebuilding in Shaw that, instead of focused on private developers, was going to create coalitions, and they did create coalitions between nonprofit community groups, especially churches, and the government. And so they're going to build housing based on those partnerships and pretty much push private developers all the way out. And they start doing
Worked
it.
for at least one person. I was able to get a house in Shaw and lived there for 20 years.
Yeah. And as they're adopting this policy, basically Nixon just cuts funding across the board, and it means that they can't get it done, or they can't continue to get it done, and it falls way short of the goals that they initially set. And it also means that as problems happen because of lack of public funding, the city and the federal government says, well, the answer is private development. So they switch to private development. Private developers buy up the lots, but there's nothing but private developers decide this isn't worth developing for decades. And so they sit on these lots and they fester, but the community was blamed. Crime was blamed, not the developers that were sitting on this, and not the city planners that chose to go with private developers instead of the community development. And so I think, and then I guess just to, a little, and then when private developers finally moved on it, they're heralded as the savior of the neighborhood. And the people that stuck in that neighborhood for decades, the people that pushed for the metro, that made private development finally attractive, that pushed for the Reeve Center, that made other development attractive, don't get the credit they deserve.
Is the NAACP still going to move to 14th and U? I believe it is, the long-term plan. I'm just wondering if that's the place I would move, given what's changed at 14th and U. But I think we're almost to questions.
We only have about 5 minutes more before we take your questions, that is. So if you want to start lining up at the microphone, you can start doing that now for questions. My last question would be, so how do we find ourselves in the situation we are in today, where Congress overturns an omnibus crime bill that had been in the making for 18 years, and several Democrats in Congress and the President of the United States all participated in the overturning of that time bill. How did we get back to a point where crime in Washington is being described in much the same way as it was in the 1930s and the 1940s? How did we get back to a time which we're talking about the home rule that all of those people who you write about in this book helped to build is now threatened once again? What happened?
DC is a really easy political punching bag. We have no representation in Congress. It's way easier to criticize DC and call for changes in DC than it is to talk about your home district or to create national legislation. So it's this hobby horse that we've seen time and time again be used as a way for members of Congress to bolster their posturing back in their home districts without facing any real political repercussions. And so, much like '68, we have another moment where there was mass protests for racial justice, and some organizations and some legislatures moved to respond to it. And there was a sense that progressives and defenders of justice were making gains. And there's been a backlash that we're seeing across the board, whether it's on a variety of civil rights issues. And as part of this playbook is being tough on crime and saying the reward you get for any progressive action is more crime, because it plays really well. And so DC, whenever they need the crime card, DC has always been at the top of the list, because everyone cares about it. It gets international and national attention, but also we can't really defend ourselves.
This program is going to be on YouTube, like all the other meetings here. I want to ask you about social media. We have more access to more information more quickly than any time in human history. But we ask ourselves, why do more people seem more ill-informed than ever before? What do you hope that your book will do, the classic book that people can buy and you sign tonight? But how do you hope to make social media pay attention to your book? I know you wrote it, you may not be the publisher, but are you going to be doing more of these talks?
I will. I think the value of history, especially, I'll say, long-form history, like a book, is that it's really easy to feel like things haven't happened before, especially in tumultuous times like the past few years have been. It feels disorienting and it feels overwhelming. And really studying the past and realizing the common threads and how this is a borrowed playbook and how things are cyclical and how people responded to also tumultuous events before can both serve as a cautionary tale but also embolden and reassure us. Reminding us of the paths not taken is a way to imagine different political futures. I don't know how social media plays into that.
Well,
but hopefully,
if the young woman had not walked down the street in Minneapolis when George Floyd was kneed in the neck for almost 10 minutes, I mean, that changed the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. And so there's some hope that social media, as chaotic as it is, can help.
There's sometimes power in seeing in the direct visualization of something, but the lines are so far drawn on these issues that I think, unfortunately, a lot of times, even that visual proof can still be spun in a way that can undermine action.
Like tourists on January 6th. Excuse me. Anybody want to have it? We're about to run out of time. Just a few more minutes. If you have a question, we'll be glad to take them. You have to come up and blend in with the post up there.
One more, and that is, you mentioned what happened after George Floyd and the expansion of the Black Lives Matter movement. You wrote a book about what happened after what some people call the urban rebellions, or others call the riots of 1968. Is there a parallel to be drawn between how conservatives in particular saw the riots of the late 1960s and the rise of militancy in the Black Power movement, and how they see today the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of the movement having to do with people who are gay and transgender?
There's a lot of parallels. I think the playbook is to focus on tactics. It's if you can talk about how people are protesting something or how they're getting their advocacies across, then you don't have to talk about the advocacies themselves. So in '68, as you know, a national leader for nonviolence has been murdered. People wanted the focus to be not on what reform should be done so it didn't happen again, but how can we further criminalize protest? And we've seen this in the US currently. After 2020, there's been numerous bills proposed that would decrease the liability for running over protesters in your car. We're seeing a huge, and then the other part of it is that any gains are met with resistance and a backlash. And I think all of the civil rights issues that we're seeing at the forefront and, you know, the huge increase in the number of bills that would limit civil rights is part of a backlash to a moment where we actually had conversations about structural racism in the US. Not all that much got done, but just the fact that we were having that conversation was enough to spur a backlash.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. You mentioned that in the aftermath of the uprising, Nixon enacted a number of policing reforms that were then adopted or served as models in other jurisdictions around the countries. Are there other examples, positive or negative, of the impact that the uprising in DC had around the country, whether on the civil rights movements or other policing reforms?
It gets a ton of international coverage. It is part of the reason that people are so concerned about DC crime. It doesn't look good to have your capital city burning, and so there's a big emphasis on that. One thing that I talk about at the local level that happens is there are actual, DC does pass, they're not enacted, but the council passes legislation that actually decreases the power of the police. One gives a civilian review board, so if a police officer has an incident of misconduct, it's not just only police officers that get to decide how they should be dealt with. It gives the community actual control. And then the other one is they pass reforms for when police officers are allowed to use their weapons. So that, you know, I think that's part of the things that I'm trying to focus on is it's not, even at a national level, there's a focus on crime and a backlash to restraint, but DC actually decides to go further and pass those type of reforms.
You next?
Yes, sir.
Get closer to the
Sure
mic,
thing.
please.
Is this all right? Dr. Sommers, thanks so much. You're such a evident expert in your topic. It's really nice to hear you talk about it. I was wondering if you could talk about your journey as an oral historian, how you were prepared, and what you learned over the course of 50 interviews about the topic, but also about the craft of interviewing and oral history itself as whatever you consider it to be, a method, an approach, a way of relating to folks.
I met you at the DC History Conference, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm going to be a huge disappointment. I did not conduct the oral history interviews. There were so many that have been done before that I used those. So I'm sorry to disappoint.
No, that's actually great.
There was already a huge archive of them.
Oral histories should be used from the archive lest they collect too much dust and nobody listens to them again. Can I just ask which ones you used?
Yeah, there's a really great collection at the Kiplinger, which is the DC History Center. The DC Public Library has a fantastic collection. The George Washington University has the Binns Chili Bowl papers that has at least 5 or 6 that have been done with Virginia Ali over the years, and I'm sure there's others, but those are the
Gelman
first that come
Library
to
at GW has the oral history of the first year of Marion Barry's term as mayor. It's a lot of great interviews. I learned a lot of stuff listening to them.
I've listened to the interview that was conducted with you for that project.
I stand by whatever I said.
Thank you.
I actually, if I'll just very quickly, the Council on Court Excellence is a group here in town. They've done some oral interviews. They've done one with court Judge Inez Smith Reed who I'm interviewing Friday for something else about the Corporation Counsel's Office. Her life stories in 4 different interviews. It's worth doing. It's an amazing story.
What would you call what you and I have been doing for the past 40 years, if not oral history?
I have been interrupting you, and I've been telling you what I'm going to do on weekends after the show on Fridays.
That's a part of oral history.
Yes. Into the microphone, please. That's why it's there.
I just have a question for you about the difference between Detroit and DC. I was living in Detroit in 1967, and the city was burning. It took a long time to come back. Would you compare the difference between that and here?
So I'm not an expert on the recovery of Detroit. I really don't know enough to comment. I'm sorry.
But this area, how long do you think it took before it became really vibrant again?
Well, 14th Street lay fallow for a long time.
I would say that you see the beginnings of it with the opening of the Metro and the Reeves Center, which is in the late 80s and the early 90s, and then it ramps up. But vibrancy is a tricky word. How do we define vibrancy, right? Like, there's communities that love the area and are advocating for the area the whole time. And I guess something that I'm trying to push back against is the idea that vibrancy isn't just determined by how many nightclubs there are or cool restaurants or coffee shops. It's also about the people there and how they advocate for their community.
Thank you.
I guess I'm next.
And we're about to have a noted agitator now, Bill Rice.
Oh, please.
Do you want to ask a question?
Well, I can't get up
No,
there.
well, I'm going to help you out. I'm from the media. I'm here to help.
In talking to leaders in Ward 7 and 8, crime is a real, next to affordable housing, is maybe the issue they consider the greatest, because they are the ones who are the recipients of the violent crime. It isn't that they don't want the police, they want a different kind of police. And is there any hope for this once this crime bill was turned down?
Indeed, can you talk a little bit about how the response was to that kind of crime in the way that Washington, D.C. was characterized? Because we have recently had a member of Congress who was attacked in her own apartment building, and one of the things you write about in the book is somebody who was attacked on Connecticut Avenue, which was not supposed to happen at that time. How did the response to that was propagated by the Nixon administration of increasing policing, which is exactly the response that is being asked for right now, in particular in Ward 7 and 8, how did it work out, and how would it likely work out in the future?
So I think whenever we're talking about crime in DC, especially when Congress is talking about it, even regardless of what the crime rates are, we need to remember that it's a political tool. And there's a reason they're focusing on DC, and there's a reason that Congress suddenly cares about the district's affairs so much. So I think I don't have the solution for DC crime, and I think that crime rates actually aren't that high right now. But I do think that we need to keep in mind the politicization of it and why leaders are using a particular moment to talk about it. Because going back into its history, the incident that he mentioned, which is when a writer was attacked on Connecticut Avenue in the 50s, crime was actually really low in DC. But leaders that were Southern leaders that were upset by the end of segregation and were trying to push for resegregation were able to use this idea of DC as this dangerous place, just as the population became more than 50% black, to push resegregation, not just in DC, but in their southern districts. So why is it being politicized? And then the other thing is, what is the impact beyond reducing crime of increasing the police in a community? A quote from the book from Julius Hobson, who was a DC activist that I really think is poignant and always kind of shapes my thinking, is Congress leads a chorus of cries for more protection by the police, while the poor pleads for protection from the police. So who are we centering, and what impact does it have on different communities?
Let me just say, the mayor she says when she wants to raise the police back up to 4,000. We are about 3,300 now, I think. And she says she has never been in a community in Washington that has not wanted more police officers. They want better policing. They want informed, what you just said, informed policing. But it's and what Charles Allen has more recently said is that both and. We spend well over $100 million on violence interruption programs, and various jobs programs, and youth programs, summer jobs programs. But the mayor says you have to do all of that, and do all of that and more, but we also have to have police officers on the street who are both sensitive to the neighborhoods and not just bullies. The same issues brought up with school resource officers, a cute way of saying cops in the schools. You know, if you talk to Trayon White in Ward 8, he's the only council member demanding that there be police officers in the schools. He says the kids are out of control. He has some authority on that since he lives there and represents the area. But he doesn't want police officers swaggering down the hallways with guns. He wants the police there to help be part of the community and not overseeing the community.
Bill Rice?
Hi, I'm Bill Rice. President Nixon signed the Home Rule Bill on Christmas Eve, 1973, 50th anniversary coming up. Any thoughts about that?
I'm glad we have home rule. I hope we keep home rule, and I hope we get statehood. I think that home rule comes out of this moment of focusing on community control. I think that's a big reason that we have the ANC structure, is because the focus on community control during this period. And, you know, Nixon did some good things for civil rights. It's a complicated legacy, but yeah, I like home rule.
We just want more of it.
And thank you.
Good evening. Why did you choose to characterize this event as a rebellion versus a riot, which is how most of us would think about it?
Riot comes with connotations of crime and has been the term used for decades, predominantly by conservatives, to embed a critique when they're discussing the events. Especially in the last 10 years, there's been an emphasis on moving away from that term to instead focus on the political intentions of the participants, which was to challenge structural inequality and race and structural racism. So it's in the literature and the way we talk about it, choosing that term centers the political and centers activism instead of centering a political crime.
The description you give in the book that I mentioned earlier about how the Black United Front and others organized themselves led to a significant black empowerment in the city. However, we now live in a city that no longer has a black majority, it has a black plurality, despite the fact that African Americans are still well represented in the elected offices in the country. Do you think that a part of what we're seeing right now on the part of maybe Congress in general and conservatives in particular to roll back home rule has been a result of that empowerment and how it has been used?
I'm not sure. I know that DC's lack of democracy has always been to a fear of black power. This goes all the way back to why we have DC, which is that Southerners insisted that the capital be forged from slaveholding states. So that's why it was formed from Maryland and Virginia. During the Civil War, DC is the first place to grant black men the right to vote. And they are such a huge percentage of the DC population at that point that they actually are almost 50% of the electorate and are able to elect leaders that push civil rights, pass and enforce civil rights reforms. White people hate this, and it's part of the reason that the part of Reconstruction is stripping DC of any right to vote for almost 100 years. In the 50s and 60s, it was actually really popular to give DC home rule, but there were Southern segregationists that prevented it from leaving committee. And time again, when you interviewed people, they would say the reason we don't want home rule is because black people would leave the city and we can't have that. So, and I think, fast forwarding to Marion Barry and the review boards, there's a lot to be said about race with that too. So I think it has always been tied to a fear of black power. I think it's interesting that the moment that the push for statehood was strongest was when DC was seen the most gentrified and seen as the most white in the public image. But now that that perception has sort of changed with the focus on crime and even the protests that happened a few years ago, we've seen that the palatability of that shift a little bit.
Any final questions or thoughts?
Being a TV person, it's 8 o'clock.
One question.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes, go ahead.
Speak into the microphone.
It seems to me.
Speak into the microphone.
It seems to me that you have 400 years of oppression in the United States, and you're talking about a specific incident. And I'm always surprised how patient African Americans are. And if I would predict there's going to be many more riots, because when I look around, I see urban America is not any different in the 50s than it is today.
I don't think they're patient, they're determined.
Well, we can be patient too. See how I let him go on after we'd run out of time?
I'm impatient.
And I think that's about all the time we have. Kyla Sommers, thank you so much. What's next for you?
Relaxing.